today's video, I want to talk about the Mamiya 7, which is a medium format film camera that I've now owned for 5 years, and I've put over 1,000 rolls of film through. I think I have a good perspective on this camera because of how much I've used this thing, how many rolls I've put through it, and just how comfortable I am with it. It is by far my favorite camera I've ever owned, and today I want to summarize my thoughts on it and share what I've learned from 5 years of experience using the Mamiya 7, putting countless rolls through it, and also sharing a ton of photos from it so you can get an idea of what the images look like out of this camera. This camera was originally made starting in 1995, and it ran all the way up to 2014 is when the last one was made. So honestly, not that long ago. I have always used the original Mamiya 7. I've never owned a Mamiya 7 II, and I've only owned a single one throughout the entire time that I've used it. I think the one thing that this camera has taught me is how incredibly valuable simplicity is when it comes to gear, and how valuable it is to learn the camera system that you're working with. I feel like at this point, I'm so comfortable using this camera and this 80mm lens, which is pretty much the only lens I've used on it for 99% of the photos that I take. And I think that was an incredibly valuable skill for me to learn, was to put all of the gear aside and just focus on really learning one camera system so that it felt like an extension of my hands, and so that I could just focus on whatever was in front of the lens and focus on improving the photos that I was taking, as opposed to worrying about more gear. That's what this camera taught me. I am so comfortable with it. I know it so well. And for that reason, it is my favorite camera. I think that could go for any camera out there, but for me, that's become the Mamiya 7. It's just what I've gotten so comfortable with over these last 5 years of taking photos. And I truly feel like that has helped my work, because I'm no longer thinking about gear when I'm out taking photos. I'm no longer thinking about what lens I should be using, what the photos will look like. I know exactly how an image or a certain kind of light will render on this camera, and how I can best take a photo of it using this system. I think once you find a camera system like this, and this might not be the Mamiya 7 for you, it might be a Pentax 645 or whatever it is, but I think that is one of the most important things in photography, is finding something you're comfortable with and just really learning it and really sticking with it. Stop worrying about switching cameras, just find one that works for you and really focus on it, so that you can almost forget about the camera in your hands and instead just interact with the environment around you. And that's what this camera has taught me, and why I like it so much. I would say this camera has primarily been used for landscapes for me, and I think that's where it's best at because of the rangefinder system that it uses. With this camera, you are not looking through the lens, which I actually think is its biggest disadvantage. Because of this, it's a lot easier to shoot photos of subjects that are far away, because the further your subject is away from the lens, the less noticeable that the discrepancy between the viewfinder and what the lens is seeing is noticeable in the end result. The closer your subject is to the camera, the more the viewfinder incorrectly represents what the lens is seeing, because it's mounted in a different position from where the lens actually is mounted. And so I think that makes this a camera that is more ideal for subjects that are further away from the lens, things that are shot at infinity. And that's what I use this camera for most, is landscapes, and I think it's partially because of that reason. That brings me on to what I think is maybe this camera's biggest advantage, which is its weight and form factor. It is incredibly light for a medium format camera, especially when you compare it to something like a Mamiya RZ67, which shoots the same size negative, but is just significantly larger in its size. The size of this camera is largely due to the fact that it is a rangefinder and there doesn't need to be a mirror inside of the camera so that you can look through the lens. So on one hand, its biggest downfall, I think, is also its biggest advantage. That's exactly why I've also traveled with this camera so much. It is so light. You can just throw it around your neck, your shoulder, and it's super easy to carry this thing all day long, every day for months at a time if you wanted to. Once you get comfortable with this system, it is incredibly nice to use. The viewfinder is very bright. It feels very mechanical. The shutter is like so nice and silent. For 99% of the time that I've owned this camera, I've used the 80mm lens. And I don't want to sit here and talk about the optical quality of it or whatever, because I don't really care. I think all medium format cameras that you can buy have perfectly good quality lenses, and if you're worried about sharpness, I feel like this is probably not the right video anyway. I think for me, I've just gotten so used to this focal length, and that's been part of the strength of owning this system for me, is just being extremely comfortable with it and really learning this one focal length very well. I think that before I even hold the viewfinder up to my eye, I already know what distance I want to be away from my subject in order to get a good composition with this lens, a composition that I like. And again, this is not so much about the camera itself as it is my experience with it and my time getting comfortable with it over the past 5 years. I think that's been an incredibly valuable lesson for me, is to just stick to one lens and just really learn that focal length. That way, when I look through the viewfinder, there's no surprises and I know exactly where to be in relation to my subject before I even hold the camera up to my eye. So I think for me, that's been the perfect focal length. It's not too wide where it creates like this dramatic image, but it's also not too tight that it's super versatile, and I can use this on anything from a wide landscape to kind of a tighter interior. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is, would I recommend this camera system if you're starting out today? I would say no, purely because of the price point. I bought this camera many years ago for $2,000, and at the time I remember that was a ton of money to spend on a camera system, and it still is today, but unfortunately the prices have gotten very high, to the point that I think if I had to buy another one, I probably would look elsewhere in a 645 format, or just deal with carrying around an RB or an RZ. I think this camera system has gotten too expensive, and if it came down to it for me, I would not be purchasing another one at the prices that they are at today. I've always owned the Mamiya 7 as opposed to the 2. The Mamiya 7 II is a lot more expensive, and I've personally never felt the need to own any of the features that are added to that camera, which I think is maybe just like double exposures and some different shutter speeds. I do not think that that camera is worth the increase in price whatsoever. Now, because I've used this camera for so long, I think I can also talk about the actual long-term ownership and technical difficulties that come with this camera, because that's not something that gets discussed a lot, and I've dealt with a lot of issues. This is not something that gets talked about often, but I think it's important to consider, especially if you're dropping $2,000 or $3,000 on a camera system. So let's get into some of the issues that I've had with it. The first is that the base plate on it cracked. This is around the tripod area, and I use a tripod so much that I think over time I just wore down the base plate. I think I was screwing it in too tight as well, but I did have to replace the base plate recently because mine was completely cracked into 2 different pieces. It wasn't leaking light yet, but it was pretty destroyed. The rangefinder I've had recalibrated many times before as well, and this is pretty expensive to do. It basically shifts out of place and it's misaligned, and you can no longer accurately focus the camera at low apertures when this happens. Now, for me, this was never a huge problem because I've always also used the zone focusing distance scale on the lens itself to double check my focus, since I'm usually shooting at infinity or close to it. But I have noticed that on mine, the rangefinder would just very easily misalign. Like on road trips, throwing it around in a bag, it's quite sensitive, and you do have to be pretty delicate with this camera, which is not something that I've typically been good at. I have had a very annoying issue with frame skipping, where I would get maybe 8 to 10 photos on a roll, and sometimes I would just double wind right past a frame, which is very annoying, especially with the price of film today. It's just like throwing away money. This is kind of a hard issue to fix as well because it's not super clear where it's coming from, but I had the camera entirely cleaned and re-lubricated and reassembled, and it seemed to help the issue, but it's still occasionally present there. So that is yet another issue that I've had with it. There are also times where it just will not fire, something to do with the contacts inside, and that is unfortunately the realities of buying these old cameras. Is they were made 20 years ago, the electronics are starting to die out on them, they've just been used extensively and are mechanically worn out, and it's something to consider, especially at the extremely high price points that these things go for. I've also heard a lot of issues that people have with the light meters in them, but I've personally never had an issue with mine, and mine has always worked great. To wrap up this video, I think I'll leave you with just a bunch more photos from this camera so you can decide if this is something you're interested in. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and finally, thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Squarespace is an incredible all-in-one website building platform that you can use to build your photography portfolio online. I've been using Squarespace for so many years now, and they've made it so easy to get a website up and running with my photography. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, you can hit the link in my description for a 14-day free trial of Squarespace. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Willem for 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. I'll see you guys next week with another video. Thank you so much for watching. Peace.